let's begin. So I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I'm Paul Barnett, and I established the Enlightened Enterprise Academy and run it as CEO. We're developing the organization at the moment, and we'll be making some announcements at the end about the ways in which it will be developing in the future as well. But I want to focus on this event and just say that we're running this event because my background was in strategic management, and I come to the conclusion that a lot of what goes wrong in strategic management, from the thinking stage through to the execution stage, is largely due to what I've called in this event the systems thinking capabilities gap. Because I don't know how you can put together a strategy effectively if you can't think systemically about the broader issues and implications of whatever it is the strategy is intended to do. I think that it'll become obvious during the course of the conversation why that's the case, but I think that's probably enough about me. I'd like to welcome Rupert McNeil and Mike Jackson, who are going to take part in the conversation, which I'll moderate, and Andy Wilkins, who will be listening, looking at your comments in the chat, and will then facilitate the Q&A session at the end. If you could keep your microphones muted and just add questions in the chat, that'd be great, because we've got too many people on the call for people to be able to ask questions directly. It will get too confusing and too time consuming. I'm going to begin now then by just very briefly introducing Rupert. So Rupert is the the government chief people officer, and has been in the role since 2016. Previously, he was group head of group HR director at Lloyds Banking Group. And for the civil service, he's responsible for the people strategy, which includes everything from culture to talent capability and so on. Many and pretty much all people issues related to the civil service in the UK. So the topic for today's discussion, he said, is very much aligned with the work that he's currently been doing within the UK government skills and curriculum unit on their capability building. So it'll be interesting to hear a bit more about that during the conversation. Mike Jackson has worked in the civil service quite a long time ago before he working in academia, and 40 years ago established the Centre for Systems Studies at Hull University. Mike was also the founder of Hull University Business School and its dean for several years, and is now a professor emeritus of the school. But he's also recognized as an international expert in systems thinking, has published more than 10 books on the topic, and the most recent book is Critical Systems Thinking and the Management of Complexity, which is really the Bible and the history of systems thinking as a discipline, but also introduces Mike's particular approach to systems thinking, which is critical systems thinking, a pluralistic approach which suggests that many of the different schools of systems thinking have got their strengths and weaknesses, and those strengths and weaknesses really depend on the specific application to which they're going to be put. So there'll no doubt be more on that during the conversation as well. I'd like to then at the end of the presentation today just explain more about what comes next, because this event is part of a program of activities that we're putting together. This is a topic that's going to become more and more relevant, and in the last few weeks it's quite obvious that it's highly topical. We can see systems failures in many different areas, and I think we'll see today some of the reasons for those and how we might go about trying to avoid them in the future. So I'm going to go into the questions now. We've got quite a bit of time for this first session, which is going to be I'll throw the questions to Rupert and to Mike, and we'll hear what they've got to say. Again, if you've got comments or questions, preferably questions, put them in the chat. So my first question to both of you really is, what does systems thinking capabilities gap? What does that term mean to you, and why do you think the systems thinking capabilities gap is a dangerous one? Perhaps Rupert, you want to respond to that first.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I think everyone on this call in their roles, I'm sure whether it's public or private sector, is in some way involved in complex systems in their management and in optimizing them. And I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there's a let me start with an interesting psychological concept that many will be familiar with, which is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. That's the line that plots on the horizontal axis competence, and on the vertical axis confidence, and the U shape that the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon describes. And I think it's true, and I think it's at least poetically true that one sees a lot of that, and that people who are less competent may be very confident in their decision making, and that is something which we all as experts and professionals have to wrestle with. And systems thinking is a really good example of this. If you've never heard of systems thinking, if it's never crossed your mind that there is a system, that you're in it and a component in it, you will take suboptimal decisions, and you'll get suboptimal, sometimes very suboptimal outcomes. So the first thing is, are people aware? Are they at the level of sort of consciously competence in knowing that they're in a system or a system of systems, and how do they operate within that? So the first systems thinking gap is knowing that you are in a system, and then knowing what questions to ask. Where is the perimeter of the system? What are its dynamics? Are there different ways of looking at that system, to pick up the great points that Mike has made in his book? And so that's gap one. Gap two is you're in a system, but you think you understand it. And do you actually understand it? Have you applied the tools to it? And I wanted just to give a couple of sort of examples, really. I mean, I think that I've got two epiphanies in my journey on systems thinking. And by the way, I'm sort of at the humble end of that Dunning-Kruger curve. I'm still learning about systems and systems thinking. But the first was 20 years ago, I was a partner in Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was a global accounting firm. It collapsed very quickly due to some things that happened in one part of it. And I remember sitting in my living room with a blank sheet of paper and drawing a line. And the lines I draw, okay, this could either be an inflection point, we'll get back to where we were before as a global organization, or we'll be into a period of decline, or we're actually at a catastrophic inflection point. And one of the things I think you need to understand if you're in the world of system thinking is you need to understand there is such a thing as catastrophe theory, and avalanches and landslides happen. And as I drew that catastrophic line, I'm sure other people were drawing it as well in their own living rooms. That was, that's what happened. That organization collapsed. So I think understanding that is really important, and knowing that that's what can happen to systems, and that their dynamics are complicated. Rolling forward 10 years to the just after the financial crisis, I was in an organization, Aviva, great insurer, great organization, which had really got to grips with the fact that customer service was highly dependent on understanding the systems which underpinned it, and made a great investment, very successfully, I believe, in the way in which understanding what frontline workers thought about the systems they're working with, how they help the customer. And that was again another humbling experience, because you understand in those situations that a lot of management decisions taken with what I would call a sort of big hand, small map type mindset can actually have unintended consequences at the tactical level of customer service and what you're doing in the system. So those are the types of gaps that I think we're dealing with, and there are multiple features of it which we can explore in this conversation. But things like, you need to understand that things can change very quickly. You need to understand that that is a possibility, and think about the dynamics within the perimeter of your system. And also you need to understand how you would test for that. And just to finish up on that point, people who know, people involved in software development and in deploying enterprise-wide software systems will know about regression testing. And regression testing is a great manifestation of a way to address the complexity of systems, because if you don't do regression testing, you won't discover the unintended consequences of what you're deploying. So I'm sort of talking a bit about the retail and tactical end of systems thinking, which I think no one can manage or operate within a large organization without having an awareness of and actually having the tools for. And I'm really pleased that within the UK government, the science profession under Sir Patrick Vallance, our Chief Scientific Advisor, the policy profession under Tamara Finkelstein, who leads that, are really actively pushing this hard in terms of the toolkits, the training, to make sure that policymakers, people involved in delivery, are really drawing on this expertise. So I feel very passionately that, well, frankly, for human civilization, we need to make sure we've covered this capability gap, but it has a very practical implication for all of our jobs. Over.
Okay, good. So Mike.
I'll try and take that on from where Rupert finished. And it is all about complexity, isn't it? And if you listen to decision makers in transnational organizations like the UN, OECD, UNESCO, World Health Organization, people in project management, engineering professions, people in government, business, charities, they all talk about complexity being the bane of their lives. And Rupert says it's about change, it's about multi-causality, non-linearity, interconnectedness, also about multiple perspectives and about having to take account of inequalities and the environment. Decision makers have to consider all these things. And the view is that traditional ways of handling complexity don't work. And so many people are turning to systems thinking as a way of handling complexity, as a possible way of managing it better, because it recognizes interconnectedness and it recognizes multiple perspectives, and it takes those things seriously. It doesn't think it's got all the solutions. Incidentally, it's modest in the way that Rupert was implying we need to be. So the problem is complexity, and people are more and more seeing the one way of navigating complexity to be systems thinking. And the issue, of course, is that there's not that much knowledge about around the place about how to think in a systems way and how to act in a systems way. Hence, there's a systems thinking capabilities gap. Just one quick example, the government's white paper on levelling up. It says at one point that all economies are complex adaptive systems, but there's no actual systemic response to that in the rest of the document. So the problem is recognised, complex adaptive systems that you have to deal with in anything like levelling up, but no systemic solutions to that. The only solution or way forward mentioned is to copy the systems management used in the Apollo program. Actually, something that Dominic Cummings is talking about these days, for as you'll know if you're subsidising his retirement, and that was successful, of course, in the Apollo project. But systems thinkers realised that it was much less successful when put on to use for social problems. So it's unlikely to be the only way forward for levelling up. So it's problem complexity, one promising answer, a systemic approach, but a big capabilities gap in being able to think and act systemically.
So we've started exploring why we think that there is a systems thinking capabilities gap and why it might be dangerous. But can I just ask, do you think that new technologies and AI and so on are actually making the dangers greater? And maybe could you just emphasize a bit what you think the dangers are if you think of specific examples? Do you want to go first, Rupert?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So great, and agree with everything that Mike has said. And on the, well, let me talk about analogies. I think Apollo is a good analogy. It's always a good analogy, but actually, I sort of feel we're a bit beyond that now. So let me take an example of a new technology that might make one think differently about systems in the way that Mike has been describing. So, for me, Apollo is great. It's a good analogy, but it's a sort of classic waterfall project, isn't it? And actually, when you look at how humanity is actually entering orbit, it's through dynamic free enterprise as much as it is through state organizations, and in rather more agile ways. So I think we can't be trapped in our analogies and metaphors too much. Where does technology really come in, though? I think is in the thing that's really struck me is the capacity for artificial intelligence to influence decision making. Now, this is something which we are, all of us on this call, going to be confronting in the next decade. It hasn't hit all of us yet, but it will hit us. And for me, the moment where I sort of really, this became most apparent to me, was with the AlphaGo victory in sort of the application of AI in playing the game of Go. And we'd seen this a bit in its earlier incarnations in chess, but what we see is artificial intelligence through machine learning really coming up with very novel, very, and some would say, aggressive strategies in games which human beings have been very familiar with for for hundreds of years. So I think that for me, all technology is about systems and integration of systems and complexity, but we're about to enter a period where with the Internet of Things, with that combined with really powerful and more pervasive AI, is going to lead to more risks, more opportunities, but also more risks. So, and I think the way I see that, and interested whether other people have views on this, and Mike, I'm sure, will as well, is things can happen much more quickly. Complex decisions can be taken much more quickly with this technology. And if we let the technology take the decisions, which personally I believe we should, if it's properly controlled, then we are going to see some quite bold and unusual decisions coming out of that, which we will need to accommodate and adjust to. So, so I think technology definitely has implications for this area, and technology where, in many cases, we're not actually going to be able to follow necessarily the logic of the decision making that's happening within the black box. And therefore, it becomes even more important that we, as the human overseers of that technology, can understand the systems that those black boxes are in and think about the range of different possible outcomes. So again, I'm speaking about this with great humility, I hope, because there are many people who know this better than me. But I think I look at that and think that's an area where the systems thinking capability gap, if we're not thinking in systems terms, we're not thinking critical systems thinking terms, could leave us a bit behind. But Mike, I'm sure, will have even more insights on that.
You might have said what I was going to add at the last bit there, Rupert, that it makes us think about what decisions machines should be taking and what decisions we as humans should be taking. And then the decisions we should be taking, we should certainly be taking a systemic approach, because they're the broader, more complex issues that computers can't deal with.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second question, which is, second question for Rupert, actually, this one. We're talking about the systems thinking capabilities gap, but I wonder to what extent do you think it's actually recognized by people in business, in the public sector, in government?
Yeah, so I think I've got several thoughts just to sort of throw out on this. So the first is that I think that there is a recognition, and I think I'm really pleased that in the UK government, and I know we've got Adam Jones from one of my colleagues from Bayes, and also Claire Searle, I think, as well, who've been working on this with Patrick Vallance and with Tamara Finkelstein and the policy profession and the science profession. So this is about, you know, systems thinking, and everything we're talking about here is science applied in the context of policy. It's that type of integration that's really really important. And so I'd really encourage people through me or through Adam and Claire and etc. to find out more about that and get involved in that movement, if you like. And it is a movement. Is how do you bring system thinking in? So I think that is recognised. I think that we're moving beyond, and this is really important, where people talk in a rather breezy way about systems leadership. I actually think systems leadership is not a particularly helpful term. It gives people perhaps a false level of confidence in their understanding of systems, but you know, it's a term that's used, so we should probably embrace it. But I think that I think that gap is being recognised. We are definitely building it into our graduate programs and the fast stream, and into our government curriculum, making sure that people do have the sort of understanding that their roles require of it. But I think actually another place where we're seeing the capability recognised, although it doesn't necessarily get called systems thinking capability, but I believe very much it is a context and a form of systems thinking capability, is in the way organisations in both the private and the public sector think about risk and risk management. And I think that you know, when you sit in on a you know, as I've had the privilege to do, you sit on a bank operational risk committee, not necessarily board risk committees too, but operational risk committee, you'll see some great examples of systems thinking as people look at the correlation between, for example, the people risk, the technology risk, credit risk, etc., and see how those can interplay. And increasingly in a you know, again, I think financial services have led on this in quite a quantified way, which is really helpful. And I think with all these areas, quantification is a very good discipline. How do I put a number on this risk? How do I put a number on the possible impact of the system, including the sort of tail risks that are there? So I think I would like to see us using risk management as a way to really imbue this systems thinking into organisations. And just to take an example, in the middle of the process of EU exit, and in the UK government and EU exit, that actually gave us a lot of skills that we hadn't had before about thinking about the UK government as an enterprise. Although it's made up of many different enterprises, it can operate as one, and we were able to sort of do that where it was useful, which gave us, I think, very good precursory mechanisms that we could use during the pandemic and use in future crises. But in that process, we, just in the people area, we looked very clearly at, you know, what could happen on the day we leave the EU, and we looked at, well, industrial action, pandemic. We looked at, you know, sadly, the possibility of, you know, state events. So there was all those things. What would they actually mean for the fact that on that day, our systems were going to shift from one state to another? And that to me was a great example of risk management, a small one, but a good example of sort of risk management thinking that was fundamentally system-based. What were the correlations? What would happen if all these things happened at once? What could throw us off course? So I think that people are realizing about the capability gap. We're building it into our training, but there's a lot more that we need to do.
It's interesting you say that, because having talked to some senior people in risk management recently, I know that there's a lot of soul searching going on in the risk management space as well. So yeah, I think it's worth having conversations with the risk management community about systems thinking for sure. I'll move on to just ask Mike if he wants to add to that, but also I wanted to ask Mike the supplementary question, which is, to what extent is systems thinking and the capabilities gap being recognised within business schools and academia more generally?
I wish the supply was there to meet the demand that Rupert's just outlined, but I don't think it is. And I speak as someone who has worked in academia for 40 odd years after my brief spell in the civil service. Universities are organised around disciplines, of course, and academics make their careers through advancing themselves in their disciplines. And universities are about giving academics a nice life and a nice career. And so they tend not to want to move outside their disciplines. And yet the problems that of the kind that Rupert mentioned, particularly the last things like exiting the EU, they're clearly transdisciplinary. They involve multiple disciplines, multiple people with different perspectives, and coming together, getting out of their silos. So no, business schools operate according to university standards, and universities are disciplinary. And disciplines are reductionist for the most part. And if you look through the history of thought for thousands of years, there's been a tension between holism and reductionism, and both useful. But universities emphasize, because they're disciplinary, they emphasize reductionism. I wish business schools would teach the kind of thing that was appropriate to the need for systems thinking. A recent book by one of our friends in the Critical Systems Forum, Martin Reeves, talked about the imagination machine and encouraging imagination. I wish business schools would talk about imagination. I wish they'd teach imagination, encouragement of imagination. I wish they'd teach the holistic perspective as well as the reductionist perspective. I wish they'd teach, I guess, what Dewey would have called general problem solving, getting people out there working on problems as part of their education so that they realize the power and the need for transdisciplinarity. But at the moment, I'm afraid they don't. And I wish people would put pressure on universities, on their trainers, on their staff development people to incorporate these systemic ideas in the kind of training and staff development that they get.
Sounds like a great call to action, and it'd be interesting to see if people want to add their support to that call to action in the chat, or if they disagree. I know we've got other academics in the group today as well. Maybe they disagree. So anyway, we'll move on to another question for Rupert, which is, to what extent do you think systems thinking capabilities gap explains the tension between the board and the executive in relation to strategy formulation and poor execution? Because I know your expertise at the moment is government, but you've got the private sector experience as well.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting area, and one which I'm actually looking at as a doctoral topic personally, because it fascinates me a lot. But let me just sort of say, give some thoughts. So first of all, my view of how a way of thinking about organizations that's helpful is that you've got every organization has a purpose. It requires a strategy to fulfill that purpose. It then has an operating model to deliver the strategy, and that has enablers within it: the people, the money, the technology, the data, and all of that swims within a cultural context as well. And keeping all those things aligned is, that's one of the tasks of management at each level. Now, that gap between the purpose for me that's the board's domain. Executive management leads at the strategy level with the mandate of the board. Now, it's interesting that what Mike was alluding to, one of the exciting things, as those of us who've been in committees and boards, hopefully have found when they're being good ones, is that you get emergent thinking. You actually get imagination, in a sense, generated on behalf of the enterprise, because the whole is greater than some of the parts when you've got people together in that type of management team or board team. Now, I think that there is a natural tension, though, between a board, think about a unitary board in an Anglo-Saxon organisation as executives and non-executives, and an executive leadership team. And of course, the further down my chain you go between purpose down to the enablers, the more sort of operational technical expertise is required to be able to manage things. And if you're not thinking in systems terms, so for example, if you're a board member making a recommendation about how to deal with a certain to take a certain action, that can be that is only going to really take effect if you've got a good understanding of the system in which you're going to execute that action, and management, particularly those closer to the customer or the citizen in our case, are going to be well placed to do that. Equally, the people who are closest to the customer and the citizen will not have the strategic context, the ability to look a bit further towards or over the horizon that the most senior management and the board will be able to do. So I think I'd probably sum that up by saying that at every level in an organization, you need to have respect for the systems below you and above you and the expertise associated with operating effectively in those systems. And you can see that, you can even see that in examples on the news at the moment. So what you say in your capital versus what happens on the ground could be quite different, and you've got lots of systems interacting. So understanding that tension can exist, being able to manage it, and being able to understand that, understanding there is a system down there, further down the organization, further downstream, that you can that your strategic intent relies on to deliver is that's one thing. But you don't actually have to be there with your up to your elbows in interfering in that system. And one of the things that I'm looking at in my research is a particular example of that, having lived through some interesting examples, which I think haven't gone so badly. So I think the way in which the UK government responded to EU exit, how it set up new mechanisms that brought officials and ministers together in new contexts, that was very effective, helped as we moved into the pandemic. If you look at a historic example where that did not go well, you look at the Norwegian campaign of 1940, where I would say a lot of interference from the board, the cabinet, meant that actually there were some very suboptimal decisions taken on the ground in the campaign in Norway and its lead up. So really interesting that interface.
I think this, and this is going to link to the question I'll ask Mike now, which is, Mike in the past has said that many people leading systems change often have a little understanding of the nature of the systems they're actually trying to change. And so, Mike, can you just explain what you mean by that a bit more? In the context
it does link to what Rupert says. In a dominant way of thinking from people involved in leadership roles, put it that way, is mechanistic still. And people act according to their mental models. So when they think about leading an organization or improving an organization, they think of it in mechanistic terms. They want to improve its efficiency. They want it to make it more efficacious in reaching its goal. Now, that's a highly useful way of looking at the world, but it's only one useful mental model, in my view, that should underpin leadership, for example. So it's equally useful to look at the world through an organismic perspective and to see the system that you're managing in terms of it being an entity which has autonomous layers to it, which must act independently as the parts of a body do. It must be coordinated. It must be capable of adapting to its environment in an agile fashion. It's equally important to be able to look at an organization or a system as a purposeful system. And this is close to what Rupert was saying when you're trying to bring purposes together at different levels of a system. External purposes of stakeholders, the purposes of the board, the purposes of the executive, the purposes of the people working in the organization. You're trying to bring multiple purposes together without generating groupthink, of course. And it's equally useful to look at systems as instruments of domination, which may benefit some people and which, through actions of which other people may be disadvantaged, and to pick up on aspects of discrimination and disadvantage. So the ability to operate with multiple mental models, I think, is a true skill for people who would lead systems or would seek to improve them or to solve problem situations. The ability to move between different mental models, and that's what critical systems thinking tries to do. It's multi-perspectival. It takes different views on the world. It doesn't think we can grasp the whole system, but it thinks it's got some very good ways of looking at systems which are insightful, and it provides a means of acting according to each of those different worldviews, which is a powerful set of tools, I think. So multi-perspectival approach and a multi-methodological approach to deal with a sort of complexity that we can't grasp as a whole.
Just following on from that, Mike, you said I think in the past that you sort of also think that the practical approach is really important, and you're concerned that the systems thinking disciplines have become predominantly theoretical and not applied enough. And Rupert said something similar when we were in the preparation call. So I wonder if you could both just comment on why you think that problem exists and what might be done about it.
Well, let me preface that by saying, yes, I agree with you, but nevertheless, systems thinking is the most practical of the disciplines or transdisciplines that I know. I started as a social scientist, did PPE at Oxford. That's considered a new degree at Oxford, incidentally, although it's been in place 100 years. And I got into systems thinking because it was a practically orientated discipline and gave me ways of translating ideas into action. Nevertheless, I agree with you in this respect, that there are certain systems institutes that are well known. The International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, it produces huge energy models which have got no clients. The Santa Fe Institute, with its agent-based modeling, reductive of human behavior, not particularly useful to decision makers involved in the hurly-burly of life. Complex system dynamics models. These are theoretical tools which can be useful sometimes, and I'm not underestimating how powerful they can be as aids if you already know what you're doing. But they are overly theoretical. So the kind of systems thinking that I would argue is useful for decision makers is the kind of systems thinking that believes it can't replace decision makers. Modelers often think they can replace decision makers and come up with answers. They can't do that. It's the experience and knowledge of the decision maker on the ground which is crucial. And what system thinking can do is perhaps to help decision makers to reflect a bit more on the mental models they're bringing to the situation they're facing and confronting, let them articulate the way that they're thinking a bit better, offer them alternative ways of thinking, which might be useful if it seems so to the decision maker in their context, and to provide ways of acting, different ways of acting to perhaps they've been used to, according to different worldviews. So it's very much, I see it as very much a decision aiding thing that can't replace the experience and knowledge of the decision maker, but can come to the help of the decision maker in ways which at least I find important.
Do you just want to add anything?
Can I build on Mike's? Yeah. Build on what Mike has said and pick up Cecilia's point. There's some great points being made generally in the chat, I see, but Cecilia's point, system thinking is about helping decision makers make informed decisions, and it is practical. So I'll declare my hand, right? There are two philosophical schools that neither of which I was taught when I did PP at Oxford, is pragmatism. Mike's already mentioned Dewey. It's about grounded common sense in the real world. Let's start from that. And process thinking, Whitehead or choose your process thinker, right? So it's about what happens in the real world, for me, the first thing to do is establish ground truth, what is actually happening on the ground. And then what systems thinking does is it's one of a set of tools that allows you, other tools, by the way, include your moral thinking, your values, your ethics, your economics, the resources you've got. It allows you to integrate that. It's an integrative process, an integrative discipline that allows you to pull that together and say, okay, what are the courses of action open to me? What are the consequences of those courses of action, and how do I do it based on the facts I'm getting from the ground? And the metaphor for me is there's a great film, if some people have seen it, with John Mills, called Ice Cold and Alex, where the ambulance finds itself in the middle of a minefield in the desert. We're always in minefields and deserts, right? We need to know what's the perimeter of the minefield, how widely spaced the mines, how do we find a safe way from where we are now to where we want to get to, and there'll be multiple routes. And systems thinking helps you do that. So it's a profoundly practical discipline, and I would be very skeptical about anybody who is believing that they've learned it unless they've actually seen it applied in context through cases and in the systems that everyone is actually operating in. And so highly pragmatic discipline.
So we've already said that.
If I can add to that, Paul, is
sure.
In relation to a book that I think we've both been looking at, a number of people have, that's John Kay's and Mervyn King's book, Radical Uncertainty. I think this is directly relevant to what both Rupert and I have said. They say that radical uncertainty is everywhere in the world. Models can be useful, but the problem with models is that they're partial, of course. The world is changing too quickly, so they're out of date before you constructed them. And models themselves have an impact upon the world. There's self-reflexivity. Models impact the world and therefore make themselves out of date, as it were. So what Kay and King say is that people operate with a more narrative perspective. In other words, they gather evidence and meaning based upon past experience, and they put together a narrative which they, in pragmatist terms, and I'm with Rupert in pragmatism as being should be the philosophical basis for systems thinking. In pragmatist terms, they use as a habit of action until it's proven to be disastrous, to be proven wrong. So you operate with a narrative, but you must be aware all the time of alternative narratives that can give you different ways of looking and acting in the world. And they use a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which says that what a good mind does is to be able to operate with two opposing ideas and yet still function. And consciously echoing that, they say that a good decision maker will operate with a dominant narrative that they're pushing things through with and working with, but always questioning it and ready to accept that it might be wrong and that alternative narratives might have something to offer. Now, that's exactly what critical systems thinking does. It seeks to prioritize ways of looking at the world, but always aware that there are alternative perspectives. It seeks to prioritize particular ways of acting in the world that correspond to the way of looking at the world that you're adopting at the moment, but always aware that there are alternative ways of acting in the world which may become more useful as things change. So it's this capacity to be multi-perspectival again, multi-methodological, which is important in critical systems thinking.
Okay, so I'm going to...
Could I jump in and just add to that?
Yeah.
May I just add to that? Just a point that
Yep.
came up in the chat about facts and the absolute nature of facts. So there's a paradox here, which I think we need to embrace. One is there are no, you should be skeptical about every fact that's presented to you, I believe, in any part of decision making. But you've got the facts you've got that you need to work with, and there are brute facts that you have to wrestle with. So back to my example, if you drive over that mine, you will blow up. So I think there is a maintaining that skepticism. I think it's the right thing. I was another great philosopher is Bishop Berkeley. So be skeptical about the facts and what you're seeing, but ultimately it is, as Mike has said, about action and systems thinking as a tool to help action.
We've covered some of the questions that we're going to follow, so that's good news because we're rapidly running out of time for this part of the session. But I wanted to just ask in relation to one of the other hot topics, agility, how useful is systems thinking in relation to achieving the prize goal everybody's talking about these days, and that's moving at the speed we need to, being as agile as we need to be? Do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's essential. I think you cannot be, if you're not thinking in systems terms, you will be driven towards a linearity, and that is not helpful to agility. So start with the outcome, and then if you understand the outcome and the system that you are moving through and giving you agency to achieve your outcome, you'll be as agile as you can be. And so I think system thinking is and that's come back to this point that I think Mark and I both making about, system thinking is about action. It's a really important aid to agility. Let me take an example, right? So you think about the resourcing needs, close to my heart, through EU exit and COVID. So what did we learn? Learned that actually we had insufficient agility in the UK government system because our systems were insufficiently interoperable. Now, they were interoperable than many other places, more interoperable, but still they were not as interoperable as we would like to have had them, being able to move people from one activity to another easily when they're operating in different departments and different systems. By looking at the UK government as a system, that has made us realize where we could create more agility, more elasticity that would make us better able to meet our outcomes. So I think it's an absolute. I think systems thinking is a prerequisite. I'll go as strongly as say that of maximizing your agility.
So just linking to that, you said in one of the previous conversations we had that you thought that the leadership mindset needs to be very widely dispersed within organizations. And
yeah,
I mean, do you think that systems thinking is the way in which to bring that about?
I think it's a great way to do it. I think that I go back to my observation, because I came into it when it was already underway in Aviva, of two things actually. The way in which that organization was able to, insurance is a complicated business. It's a retail business. It's a wholesale business. And like any customer service business is a complex business. But what I thought was really clear there was through thinking about systems thinking and system science, people knew that they knew how to interpret the ground facts coming from the frontline agents up to what senior management wanted to have happen, and ultimately what shareholders wanted to have happen. And there was a very clear link with people understanding the systems they're operating in better and understanding the links between them and how the actions that they took in either direction had an impact on the overall system, whether it was what the customer experienced or what the shareholder experienced for the share price. Now, the thing there, though, by the way, just worth saying, is that in our organizations, to your point on leadership, the place where the pressure in the system is most acutely felt, I believe, is in middle management. So that's between the people who are doing the frontline delivery and the people who are taking the strategic decisions about capital allocation and things like that. The conflict, the resolution of those conflicts happens at the level of middle management, and that's where you particularly need to build systems thinking capability. And I'm glad to see that in many organizations that's increasingly happening. That's where the trade-offs happen. That's where the risks are being managed, and it's really important. System thinking, should be part. Being able to think in that way should be part of every leadership curriculum, in my view.
Paul, I'm reminded of a comment by Stafford Beer that a Martian coming to Earth and looking at the models we have of organizations would assume that the person at the top has a brain weighing half a ton, because all the information flows up to that individual according to the organization chart, and that individual is responsible for taking all the decisions and then feeding all the instructions back down again. and you can't operate that way in a world of complexity. You have to devolve decision making to the right levels and have leadership at all levels of the organization as appropriate, in order to manage the variety that change and the environment throws at us.
Right. Okay. Andy, I hope you're on standby. I know we've got loads of questions going in the chat box, so I'm sure you've been keeping Andy busy. I'm just giving you fair warning that we could start the Q&A with the audience in a second, but I want to just ask to finalize this section, 1 minute each, if we can do that, on how do you think we're going to go, or what should be the priorities in solving the systems thinking capabilities gap? Maybe, I don't know, Rupert, do you want to go first and just say, if you had to decide, what are the biggest priorities?
I think the biggest priority for me is giving as many people at every level in the organization the tools to think in a systems thinking way. And I've quoted Aviva many times, and this is another time I will quote it again without taking any credit for the initiative, but I watched it and was hugely impressed, which is there was a moment where there was a decision that everybody in Aviva needed to understand as an insurer what economic capital meant. And in doing that, they took a conscious decision to really do that across the whole system. Now that meant that if you're if you're in senior management, then you need to understand it, or an actuary, you need to understand it at one level of complexity, one level of detail and complexity. But frankly, if you were a PA or frontline employee of any kind, you also need to understand it. So they introduced a really comprehensive training program that did that, whether it was a 2-minute video that explained what economic capital was, or the 1-week training course. And I think that systems thinking for me falls into that category, but if it falls into that category, you can't really operate in the complex systems that we're all in without having a basic understanding of it. And whether it's part of the movement that we're all part of, being part of this call, we tie it to other things like thinking intelligently about risk, or other initiatives. We need to build that, and it needs to be part of all our curricula. I think in a way it's not helpful to even think about it as a subject that is optional or added to things. There is no discipline or subject which can't be expressed or enhanced without applying this lens to it. But I'll defer to Mike, because he's got many more years of experience of teaching this and thinking about it than me.
Difficult, because there is, as Rupert said, I've never known in all the years I've been trying to get the systems message across such interest and demand for systems thinking and people who know about systems thinking and thinking about it and using it. And there's a huge tradition of systems thinking. So there are people around who've been working in different areas of systems thinking for a very long time, and there's a large background of research there. Now, I don't think that tradition of research that exists in the different systems thinking traditions of complexity and soft systems and viable systems is that well known about. So unfortunately, what tends to be happening is that a lot of people are offering consultancy or courses, training courses in systems thinking, and they have no knowledge of the history. So they're either trying to, they don't know what's happened in the past, and they're either doing things which we know didn't work in the past, or they're seeking to reinvent the wheel. So there's certainly a need, as Rupert says, for significantly more attention to good quality training courses, good quality programs in universities, where there are very few universities which teach this imaginative, holistic, transdisciplinary way of thinking and working. And there's a need to bring together in a better fora than we have at the moment. I hope the Critical Systems Forum is one way of doing this, and the Enlightened Enterprise Initiative, those with a need for systems thinking and those who hopefully know what they're talking about in the systems thinking area. And then from that, we can find out what ideas are useful, which aren't. We can feed them into practice, and we can develop, real new thinking, think tanks perhaps, which tackle problems as they arise and contribute to policy issues in a way that systems thinking hasn't done in the past, or not as well as it should have done.
I'm going to shorten my comments at the very end, so we should still get at the 20 minutes of Q&A. Andy, can I, well, let me just introduce Andy. Andy's a colleague with me at the Enlightened Enterprise Academy, has been working in a very complex systems-led, well, a very complex system, which is the healthcare system in recent years, and so understands this topic quite well. But also regularly moderates Q&As in conferences. So I'm leaving this section to Andy to go through. Andy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much for that kind introduction. Wow, there's been a huge amount of activity in the chat during this conversation. So this topic has touched a nerve with, I think, a lot of people in the chat who are either violently in agreement or challenging. So there's a whole parallel conversation going on in the chat, as well as the conversation between both you, Mike, and Rupert. But I thought I'd pick out a couple of the questions that are perhaps, to start with, some of the most practical ones that people could find useful. There's a general agreement that what's being talked about is extremely relevant for our moment and our time, but how do we take this frame of thinking into a world that's dominated by another frame of thinking, and how do we make that transition? Seems to be a question that's coming up quite frequently. So Sean Lyons is saying, from a boardroom perspective, where do you begin in order to adopt a holistic view which requires the ability to apply an interdisciplinary approach across a multi-dimensional level? So a mechanistic board needing to think and act in this way, how would you start if you had a board that was thinking in a more traditional mechanical way, and someone in the board wants to bring forward an attempt to try and recast the thinking in more systems thinking way? How would you begin that? How would you start that conversation in the board?
I'll let Rupert start with that one.
Thanks, Mike. I think that I would put it in the wrapper of risk. Every board is in the UK, increasingly internationally, is going to be obligated to think about risk. If you look at what the FRC requires of them and others, and I think that if you start from that perspective, saying how do we think about risk, systems thinking is the natural next step in my view, because it's about, well, what are the unintended consequences, what could happen, how are we exposed, and to do that meaningfully, you've got to have a good understanding of your system, and it will take you rapidly into other things. And this is the practical step I'd suggest, which is, people should not underestimate their power to convene and to bring together people from different disciplines. And maybe that's the first thing, is have we ever had a conversation about this topic on our risk register with all the functions that have an interest in it? And I'd pick some topics which really lend themselves to this. One I would pick on, which everybody should be thinking about if they're not already, is cyber threat, cyber security. There isn't a part of an organization that isn't touched by that in some way, and I think is a really interesting testing ground to have good conversations, if they're not already happening, at a systems level, where everyone can make a contribution. I mean, the good thing about systems thinking contributions when they're convened is they're very non-hierarchical and flat. Everyone brings their expertise to it, and you get emergent thinking, new solutions, really good ideas coming out of that. So I go risk, convene the specialists, pick a topic, a tangible one where action is essential. Cyber's a good start.
Mike,
can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure.
And so I would agree with what Rupert just said, but also add to that, that risk tends to always look at the downside rather than the upside as well. And so the board's responsibility is creating as well as protecting value. And I think then if you look at value creation from a systemic point of view, then it should be looking at both sides of the coin, not one side or the other, because there's no opportunity without risks, and there's no risks without opportunities, is what I would argue. And it's the topic of the book that I was working on recently, the yin and yang of reputation management, reputation obviously being one of the risks. So that's the point I wanted to just make. I don't think it should be all about downside risk.
Mike,
Well
what would you,
said.
I think
your
risk
thoughts
is
on that?
risk is a very good starting point, because so many people feel at risk, and so many organisations feel at risk. So if I can put it in theoretical terms, it's like the situation where you're getting to a change of paradigm in the Thomas Kuhn sense, where traditional ways of doing things and acting are failing in so many different areas. So many anomalies are creeping up where traditional methods won't work. And that I find that with speaking to project management associations, systems engineers, people in business and in charities, with people in the World Health Organization, looking at different ways of, they know that the traditional ways of doing things are not working. And so their organizations, if they're going to be relevant, have to make some kind of paradigm change. And I think we're at the point where everybody recognizes the anomalies, that the old ways of thinking and working are not operating well, but we're not quite at the point where people are ready to embrace the alternative of systems thinking. So there's an interesting question that we started to talk about at the end, from how you get from the stage of anomaly to the stage where the new thinking people become equally comfortable with the new way of thinking.
There's if I could add a little twist on this as well, there's quite a few comments coming in around purpose. People are either supporting that or challenging that. But Mike, you said purposefulness, if you like, is an important dimension around which to frame understanding our system-based activities in service of something purposeful. And it speaks, I think, to Paul's point about creating value and linking that to purpose. So how do we take traditional metrics of success and recast them in the language of purpose that might get different actors, different silos to see they're all contributing towards a common goal, if you like, which helps orientate the various pieces of the organization around more systemic, integrated thinking? That's sort of the function of an organization surely is to create more value, as Paul said, in service of its purpose. And if that's more clearly articulated and everyone can see what they contribute to that, the potential for more systemic ways of working potentially come about. Is that part of what we also need to be thinking here?
It is, but you need to start from the fact, like, take a quote from another systems thinker, Churchman, that systems thinking begins when first you see the world through the eyes of another, which means that there are multiple purposes, all of which have some validity in organizations and among stakeholders of organizations. So you cannot impose purposes in a mechanistic way, in the way that people used to believe that they could. You have to work with purposes and do so in a learning mode. In other words, have stakeholders and the people in the organization engage in a systemic discussion that Rupert just mentioned. Get away from the hierarchy. Let everybody put their thinking on the table. Expose it to alternative worldviews. Red team thinking, assumption surfacing and testing, willingness to engage in debate, and through that you might get some genuine alignment of purpose, rather than some sort of perceived alignment of purpose because somebody's imposing it.
So there's another question coming in, which I think it relates to what we're talking about, which is, could anyone point me to good references on assessment of individual or organizational systems thinking capability? And this has come from Sani Pelgrim. And I guess this is pointing to organizations may be quite immature or very mature, and where are they and how well are we doing and what more could we be doing? Is that the right way to think about it? Is how do you assess your systems thinking capabilities and what needs to be improved or enhanced?
Mike, I can give a layman's view, but you might want to
No, you go, and
I think there is maybe you've hit, Andy, on the systems thinking capability gap, right? What's a manifestation of it? We don't necessarily have a common way of thinking about these things as we do, and I keep coming back to risk management because I think it's quite an interesting example of a new discipline and movement that's only less than 40 years old really in its current form. Is we've got concepts like the 4 lines of defense or the portfolio or people being risk on and risk off, which is an interesting example of different entities in the same situation that can benefit from each other because actually they've got different purposes when it comes to their risk appetite. One sees an opportunity, one sees a downside they want to eliminate. So I think there is a really interesting opportunity over the next, let's say, for the sake of argument, decade, that we start to get more consistency in how we talk about this topic. Now that will happen in, is there a way in which someone could go from one board to another, as they can in the world of risk, and have an understanding of some of the systems features in a similar sort of way? So, but I don't actually. I would love to know if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think we've yet got to that level of consistency. But equally, when you get to a level of consistency, you want to make sure we're not trapped in the paradigm that consistency represents. So that's the paradox. It's only going to be a set of tools that will evolve, and we need to build on the great work that Mike and others, many on this call, have done to try and start to sort of formulate that. There's no maturity model of systems thinking, which is an interesting question. What would that look like?
Yeah, that's right. I think there are some extremely useful systemic perspectives that have proven themselves over time, if you like. And this is back to a sort of pragmatist orientation. So we've learned particular ways of thinking and acting which have served the human species over time in our engagement with the natural world and our engagement with social reality. And we can build on those, and we can build a mature systemic movement on those. So if I was evaluating an organization or its risk capacity to handle risk, and looking at whether all the parts of it were working together, board, executive, and workers, I'd be looking at it from a mechanistic perspective. Is it working well as a machine? Is it efficient and efficacious? But I'd be wanting to make sure that people were looking at it from the organismic perspective. Is it adaptive? Are the parts working together and functioning well? Is it coordinated? Is there sufficient local autonomy to pick up the messages from the environment? I'd want to look at it in terms of whether purposes are aligned in the way that we've been talking about. The various purposes have been aired, and some kinds of accommodations have been reached between different purposes. I'd want to be sure that my organization was looking at who it might be disadvantaging through its actions. And so many cases arise where organizations have not thought about that in advance and get into awful trouble when they realize they haven't taken important stakeholders into account. So all these things must be upfront in their thinking, and system thinking can help that to occur. And as a result, organizations will be much better prepared for whatever is thrown at them. So that's a rounded starting point of systemic perspectives, which I think can enable organizations to be more agile in response to the different things that they need to think about in improving themselves, and also in responding to risk.
Yeah, can I make one point, Andy, just quickly?
Yes, sure.
Which is that there's we talk about STEM, and increasingly, I'm glad to say, we talk about STEAM as well. There are great allegorical and poetic insights to help us think about systems thinking while we're building the other tools. And if you've, one of the most powerful metaphors for me is in Norse mythology, the legend of Balder and Loki and the mistletoe. And that to me is, you can take that as a really interesting example of risk management and systems thinking, and how even a tiny element in your system could actually have a fatal effect on it if you haven't understood it and its consequences. So I think there are, humans have been dealing with systems thinking and thinking in this way for millennia and millennia. we've now got the opportunity to systematize it, apply scientific tools to it, but that poetic core actually still exists and is still a resource for us to use.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I was reading Kursler was a big systems thinker. He was into holistic thinking, and one thing he said in a book that I was reading, Janus, a sort of summary of his work, was, look how good we've become scientifically at ensuring prediction and control, and at the technologies we've developed. Look how poor we are in terms of serving humanity and building social structures and societies which serve everybody properly and develop the human potential. Something's going wrong. You know, all the emphasis, I agree with I'm the last person to knock the mechanistic view and the scientific view and the reductionist view, but it needs complementing now with these other ways of thinking, some of which are artistic. And we'll never get, you know, we live in a symbolic universe as human beings, and that changes everything. We've got the ability to think and to think creatively, to change the world. And we need to find ways of doing this that improve our ability to be successful, just as scientists helped us to improve our ability to predict and control the natural world. It's the enlightenment prospect, if you like, realizing itself on that second dimension, helping human potential and society to develop in the same way that it's helped science and technology to develop. And the two need to start working in tandem.
Well, there have been a couple of comments, you know, Dave Snowden, Jeff Marlowe and others have made the point that becoming self-aware of your own capacities for systems thinking, once you start putting metrics to it, they get gamified, and then the whole edifice starts to unravel through its own attempts to hit physical targets. So there is some caution being expressed by some of the people here about how to do it. But the notion that being aware of one's own capability and being able to enhance and improve it, how we become that, gain that consciousness and awareness seems to be quite important. There's a question coming in from Katie Grono, and again, being quite pragmatic here, and I think this is quite valuable for people on the call. So we talked a lot about leadership and systems thinking, but the point was made, I think, by both of you that middle management, lower hierarchies within the organization, this is where the real action can start to manifest itself in different ways of working. And certainly the work I'm doing in healthcare, for example, around lots of silos being good at what they do, but integrated care around the person is where the most transformational change can be made in health outcomes. So Katie makes the point, to me, the capability for systems thinking in government and elsewhere is a combination of having the right skills and also the right opportunity to use it. She says the skill side is comparatively straightforward, if not a quick thing to achieve, but how do we create the space, time, and desire for systems thinking for people who are embedded, I guess I'm adding this to her, in the machine, running as fast as they can to hit the targets and all the rest of it. So even if they can see it and we can teach them the skills, the opportunity and space to really bring that alive is often quite difficult. So people default back to the old system again. How do we overcome that? Rupert, you must have some insights and experience in that.
Yeah, I think that a good thing is that, I mean, I recognize the challenge. I think that one of the very positive changes that's happened over the past 20 years in organizations, the public and private sector, is that there is much, probably not enough, but much greater attention to what the person engaging in the actual service has to say about how that service is delivered. And whether it's the nurse or the practitioner working with the patient, or whether it's, take an example, the person in the job center supporting the person looking for work or benefits help. Those are all examples I think we can sort of draw on and helpful ones. I think there is an interesting question, which is, if you find yourself in a system where your insights are not being listened to, and this can be a really hard thing to bear in mind, is maybe leave that system. It's not going to be healthy for you or for what you're doing. Be confident that your skills will be valuable elsewhere. But I think that's a very, very small minority of cases. I think in most cases, yeah, and part of the skill of this area, or part of this area, is helping people communicate the insights that they have about the system they're in to people who are not as close to the roles and the risks and the issues as they are. I think it's very encouraging. I mean, I work with ministers, senior officials in government, and I think they are all very receptive. Only this week was with one who was saying, we need to be paying even more attention to what people in our operational roles are saying. That's a really a really important thing. So I agree with the point.
Yeah, I mean, in a machine type organization, the supervisors blame the workers and they blame the middle management. The middle management blames the supervisors and blames the senior management. The senior management blames the middle management. Everybody's got somebody else to blame. But if you take it to the middle management thing, it's almost a structural thing. That the problem for middle managers is that senior managers won't get out their way. They tend to intervene too much and to interfere too much in what middle managers are doing, and they don't give them space and autonomy to operate in the way that they need to operate. And once they gain that autonomy, then they will start to look more systemically at the problems that they face and come to recognize the need for systems thinking. If they're always responding to fear and to command, then they're never going to gain the expertise which will allow them and the organization as a whole to flourish.
And Andy, could I just jump in, because I see a comment in the chat about a stage of middle-aged white men. So I want to pick that one up because it's a good point. It's a good point.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's happened in the past month is we've published our civil service diversity and inclusion strategy. And the point is well made, right? There is a huge link here between both diversity and inclusion and systems thinking that is worth mentioning. So I think that, and it is linked to diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of characteristic, all of those things that need to be brought together. And then once they've been brought together, making sure we've got the inclusive practices, particularly at the level of the team, which is something we talk about in that strategy, which is really important. And I think the systems thinking as a way of generating more inclusive workplaces, and more inclusive workplaces being a way of actually managing systems better is a really important point. But I wanted to acknowledge that important point that was made in the chat.
Yes, yeah, and thank you for spotting that and speaking to that. I think that was a point well made. Just very personally, I've seen in health this problem of middle and operational staff being sort of shredded in the machine at the moment, and lots of them bailing out. I think we'll see a bigger problem then, and a couple of people in the chat have mentioned that. Probably will. I don't know if we have time, Paul. We've got one more question, I think, which might be appeal to you, Mike. So it comes from Funmilola Asa. I don't know whether she's an academic herself, but she's fascinated in this paradox of what will drive greater systems thinking, but in the relationship between academia and business. Is it a greater demand of systems thinking which will eventually get academia to respond to this, or do academia need to be leading the way in order to foster and develop more systems thinkers into business that can change the nature and way that our organizations and institutions work? It's how do we solve the chicken and egg problem?
Academia is very slow to respond, so it is a matter of pressure being put on academia to change the nature of the way that people are taught in universities. I mean, some things have obviously been done which are useful, and apprenticeships, I think, are a step forward, and there is a systems thinking apprenticeship which I should mention. But I would like to see universities get away with murder, and there should be politicians believe vice chancellors. It's a comfy club, and it's about time there was more challenging of the type of education, the type of teaching that goes on in our higher education institutions, I think. So put pressure on, and let's see more relevance. You just ask employers; they're not getting the people that they feel they need. More needs to be done to put pressure on higher education and colleges to produce people who are going to be better fitted for dealing with the sort of problems of AI that Rupert's talked about, better fitted for the complexity of the world that we face.
Right. I think for issues of time, I want to hand back to Paul to give him enough time to make the relevant sort of closing comments and talk a little bit about where things are going in the future. But that's been a fantastic conversation. We've had some really rich conversations developing in parallel, as I said, within the chat, but also these questions, I think, get really real to the heart of how do we take this general awareness that a new frame and a new way of thinking about things, a new set of mindset is required, and how do we take that mindset, understand what it is, and start to build it into the fabric of our institutions and organizations that are so steeped in historical ways of doing things. And it's not an easy challenge. It needs to be challenged and attempted to be engaged with at multiple levels, and I think that's what we've been exploring. And Mike and Rupert, thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom, and I'm sure anyone listening to this will go away wiser when they came as to how to go about this challenge. Obviously, it's an ongoing and unfolding set of challenges that hasn't no final completion, but I think you put us on the right pathway for a greater consciousness and awareness of what's required. So thank you so much for that. Paul, I'll hand back to you.
Well, thanks very much. I do want to make sure we finish on time. So yeah, and I think we will be able to. I'm sure today's conversation is going to provoke a lot more discussion, and we've also got ideas in mind for future events. But after we've started the program last year, we then created a LinkedIn forum. At the moment, planning and designing to replace or to create an institute that the forum will become a part of. We think that we want to basically take Mike's existing 10 books, and especially the most recent one, as the start of a growing body of knowledge, and even more importantly, a body of practice, and invite other people then over time to contribute to a body of knowledge and practice. There probably are existing pools of knowledge and practice out there. We want to try and aggregate as much as possible and evolve the thinking as best we possibly can, with a focus on improving practice. So you'll hear quite a bit more about the critical systems thinking and practice, the institute that we're creating, and we'll be putting together 2 advisory groups. One will be academics with an interest in practice, and the other will be a practitioner advisory group. I'm hoping that we'll be able to play a part in and create the bridge between academia and practice. I think both are important, and we've heard during this conversation this afternoon that at the moment there's too much of a gap, and I think that explains partly why there is a capabilities gap in systems thinking. So I hope you'll have a look at the website. You can register to join the mailing list and get announcements as they come. With Mike, well, maybe people know already Mike's book in 2019 was a good nearly 700-page deep dive into the topic. There are plans that Mike and I are discussing to work on a practitioner guidebook to take those ideas and make them even more practical. And Mike and I have been working on the design of a course for executives who want to get more into systems thinking as well. So details of that will be again published on the Institute website. In the UK, we can't call ourselves an institute until we are one. So it will be an institute in time. It's not an institute right now. We've got to go through the steps to make that happen from a legal point of view. But do take a look at it and do join us if you think there's merit in making this happen. And I think most people on the call probably do, otherwise they wouldn't probably be on the call. If you've got any thoughts, questions, or want to reach me anytime, you'll be able to do that via the website. And similarly, you'll be able to reach Mike in the same way. And Rupert has already suggested that he might be working with us or writing some papers in related topics to contribute to future conversations as well. I'd encourage anybody else on the call that wants to contribute their thinking to get in touch with Mike and I and work out how we might do that, either through papers or events and so on. So with that, I'll just, well, it just remains for me to say thanks for Andy to moderate what was a challenging set of questions. I'm sorry we never can on these things get through all of them, but we'll certainly be taking a look at them, and we'll try to get back to some of them or incorporate them into future events. And thanks to Mike, who I know is suffering a little bit at the moment, for managing to stick with it. So that was great. And thanks especially to Rupert for taking the time out. I know he's extremely busy at the moment, so it's great to have the time that he's committed today. And I'm sure we'll engage further with Rupert in this conversation as we go forward as well. So thanks very much to them, and thanks very much to everybody on the call for taking their time out and contributing their thoughts in the chat and so on as well. We look forward to being in touch, and I'll send a follow-up email soon after this event, and I'll edit the video recording of the event and share that with people who signed up as well. Okay, that's it. Thanks very much indeed.